Kindness is a spark that can ignite a storm. Jason Creed, a grease-stained mechanic with a past cloaked in shadows, whispers of a life once spent outrunning danger, hides in a crumbling garage. A boy's desperate cry pierces the silence. Ben, trapped in a shattered wheelchair, his mother's eyes pleading. Jason's hands, once steady with a gun, now tremble as he fixes the chair for free. Days later, a private jet roars onto the dusty airstrip. A billionaire's gaze locks on him. A job, a purpose, a way out. But his return to the world he fled will unravel secrets, forge bonds, and test his soul. The spark has caught. Now the fire will consume all. Subscribe if you care about those in need. Another special story awaits. Let's dive back into the story. The garage smelled of oil and regret, a sanctuary of rusted tools and flickering fluorescent lights. Jason Creed hunched over a dented carburetor, his calloused fingers moving with a rhythm born of years, decades maybe, spent coaxing life from machines. His face, weathered beyond his 38 years, bore the scars of a man who'd seen too much, a jagged line across his left cheek, a souvenir from a night he wouldn't speak of. The townsfolk of Dust Haven whispered about him, ex-soldier, ex-con, ex-something dangerous. But he kept his head down, his past buried beneath layers of grease and silence. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal trees lining the cracked road. It was late, the kind of late where the world felt like it was holding its breath. Then came the sound, a soft, broken sob, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Jason's head snapped up, his instincts flaring, old habits from a life he'd tried to forget. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped into the dim glow of the street lamp. There he was, a boy no older than 10, slumped in a wheelchair that looked like it had been through a war of its own. The frame was bent, one wheel wobbling uselessly, the other flat and shredded. His small hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white, his face streaked with tears. Beside him stood a woman, his mother, Jason guessed, her coat threadbare, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She knelt beside the boy, murmuring comforts that didn't reach her own trembling voice. "Please," she said, catching Jason's gaze. "It broke down a mile back. We've been pushing it ever since. I don't have money, but—" Jason raised a hand, cutting her off. He didn't need the story. He'd heard enough pleas in his life to know desperation when he saw it. "Let me take a look," he muttered, his voice rough as gravel. He crouched beside the chair, ignoring the ache in his knees, and ran his fingers over the damage. The boy, Ben, he'd learn later, watched him with wide, fearful eyes, like Jason might be a savior or a monster. Maybe both. The repair would take hours. Parts he didn't have. Money he couldn't spare. His own rent was overdue, the landlord's threats growing sharper by the day. But something in Ben's gaze, fragile, hopeful, clawed at a part of Jason he'd thought long dead. He stood jaw tight and nodded to the mother. "I'll fix it, no charge." Her lips parted, a protest forming, but he turned away before she could speak. He dragged the chair into the garage, the squeak of its broken wheel echoing like a ghost wail. As he worked, the night deepened, and the wind carried a faint, unfamiliar hum, a sound that prickled the hairs on his neck. He didn't know it yet, but that hum was the first ripple of a wave about to crash over his life. Hours later, Ben rolled out of the garage, his laughter bright against the dark. His mother's gratitude was a quiet, tearful thing, her hand pressing Jason's briefly before they disappeared into the night. Jason stood alone, staring at the empty road, a strange warmth warring with the cold knot in his chest. He didn't see the shadow watching from the hill above, or the glint of binoculars catching the moonlight. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the sky pressing down on Dust Haven like a lid on a boiling pot. Jason woke to the sound of his own heartbeat, too loud in the stillness of his cramped apartment above the garage. Sleep had been a fleeting thing, chased off by dreams of gunfire and faces he couldn't place, memories that clawed their way up from the dark corners he'd locked them in. He rubbed his eyes, the sting of exhaustion settling into his bones, and stumbled to the sink. The mirror showed a man he barely recognized. Hollow cheeks, shadowed eyes, that damn scar glaring back like a taunt. Downstairs, the garage was quiet, the echo of Ben's laughter from the night before, lingering like a ghost. Jason tried to focus on the day's work, a rusted pickup that needed more than he could give it, but his hands felt unsteady, his mind drifting. He kept seeing the boy's face, the way his fear had melted into a grin when the wheelchair rolled smooth again. It had been years since Jason felt useful, since he'd done something that didn't end in blood or regret. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Get it together, Creed." The hum came again at noon, louder this time, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Jason stepped outside, squinting against the overcast sky. Dust swirled in the distance, kicked up by something moving fast along the old airstrip a mile out. The strip hadn't seen a plane in decades, not since the mill closed and the town started dying. He frowned, unease prickling his skin, and grabbed his jacket. Old instincts screamed at him to stay put, to mind his own business, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled him toward the sound. The airstrip was a cracked stretch of concrete, weeds clawing through the seams. Jason stopped short when he saw it. A sleek private jet, black as midnight, its engines still humming as it sat like a predator at rest. A man stepped out, tall and sharp-suited, his silver hair catching the dull light. He moved with the confidence of someone who owned the world, or at least the parts that mattered. Behind him, two others emerged, their postures stiff, eyes scanning the horizon. Bodyguards, Jason clocked instantly. He'd known men like them before, in a life he'd buried. The silver-haired man spotted him and strode over, his smile polished but cold. "Jason Creed?" His voice was smooth, clipped, like he'd practiced the name. Jason tensed, his hand twitching toward a pocket he hadn't carried a weapon in for years. "Who's asking?" "William Hawthorne." The name hit like a punch. Billionaire. Tech mogul. The kind of man who didn't step foot in places like Dusthaven unless he wanted something. "I heard about what you did for the boy. Ben, was it? Impressive work." Jason's gut twisted. How did this man know? "It was nothing," he said, voice flat, eyes narrowing. "Just a fix." Hawthorne's smile didn't waver. "Not to me. I run a facility, state of the art. We build mobility devices for people like Ben. I could use a man with your skills." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A job, Mr. Creed. Good pay, purpose, a chance to leave this." He gestured at the crumbling town. "Behind." Jason's throat tightened. Purpose. The word echoed in his skull, stirring something he'd tried to drown in oil and solitude. But there was a catch. He could feel it in the air, in the way Hawthorne's eyes gleamed. "Why me?" he asked, low and hard. Hawthorne tilted his head, studying him. "Because I see potential, and I don't waste it." He handed Jason a card, crisp and embossed with a single address. "Come see for yourself. Tomorrow. Jet leaves at dawn." Jason stared at the card as Hawthorne walked back to the plane, the engines roaring to life. The jet lifted off, leaving a trail of dust and questions. He didn't notice the figure watching from the tree line, a man in a faded coat, his face obscured, a phone pressed to his ear. The past wasn't just stirring, it was awake. Back at the garage, Jason sat on a stool, the card burning a hole in his pocket. He thought of Ben, of the life he'd scratched out here, of the shadows he'd run from. A job, a way out. But at what cost? The hum of the jet lingered in his ears, a siren call he couldn't unhear. And somewhere, deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about a wheelchair anymore. The night stretched thin, a fragile thread between dusk and dawn. Jason sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, the card from Hawthorne gripped between his fingers. The address stared back at him, some facility 3 states over, a place he'd never heard of, but could feel pulling at him like a tide. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind churned with fragments of the past, the crack of gunfire, the weight of a blade in his hand, the screams he'd silenced to survive. He'd been a ghost for years, hiding in Dusthaven, but ghosts didn't get offers from men like Hawthorne. Ghosts didn't get second chances. He stood, pacing the creaking floorboards, the hum of that jet still buzzing in his skull. The garage below was his anchor, small, broken, his, but it was all he had. Could he leave it? Could he trust this billionaire who knew too much, who tracked him down like prey? The scar on his cheek itched, a reminder of the last time he'd trusted the wrong man. That night had ended in blood and a promise to never look back. Yet here he was, teetering on the edge of something he couldn't name. Dawn broke cold and sharp, the sky bleeding red over the airstrip. Jason slung a duffel over his shoulder, tools, a change of clothes, the bare minimum, and locked the garage behind him. The key felt heavy in his hand, a tether he wasn't sure he'd reclaim. He walked the mile to the strip, boots crunching on gravel, his breath fogging in the chill. The jet waited, engines idling, a sleek beast against the cracked earth. Hawthorne stood beside it, his suit pristine despite the dust, his smile a blade's edge. "Decided to see for yourself?" Hawthorne asked, voice carrying over the roar. Jason nodded, jaw tight. "I'm not sold yet, just looking." "Fair enough." Hawthorne gestured to the steps. "After you." The interior was a world apart. Leather seats, polished wood, the hum of wealth. Jason sank into a chair, feeling out of place, his grease-stained hands stark against the luxury. The jet lifted off, smooth and silent, and Dust Haven shrank below him, a speck swallowed by the horizon. He watched it go, a pang twisting in his chest. That town had been his cage, but it had also been his shield. Hours later, they landed at a sprawling complex nestled in a valley, glass and steel gleaming under the sun, surrounded by mountains that loomed like sentinels. Hawthorne led him inside, past security gates and white-coated technicians, into a space alive with purpose. Machines whirred, crafting wheelchairs, prosthetics, exoskeletons, devices that gave people back their lives. Jason's breath caught as he watched a young girl, no older than Ben, take her first steps in a robotic brace, her laughter echoing off the walls. "This is what we do," Hawthorne said, his tone soft but firm. "You could be part of it. Your hands, they're wasted on rusted trucks." Jason's fingers flexed, the memory of Ben's wheelchair sharp in his mind. He wandered the facility, drawn to the workbenches, the tools so advanced they made his own look prehistoric. A technician showed him a prototype, a chair that adjusted to its user's movements, light as air but strong as steel. Jason traced its frame, awe warring with doubt. He could build this. He could matter. But the doubt lingered, a shadow at his heels. Why him? Why now? Hawthorne's gaze followed him, too knowing, too intent. As they returned to the main hall, a man brushed past Jason, tall, wiry, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Jason froze. That face, he'd seen it before years ago, in a warehouse thick with smoke and betrayal. His pulse hammered. The man disappeared into the crowd, but the damage was done. The past wasn't just awake, it was here. Back on the jet that evening, Hawthorne pressed him. "Stay, join us. You've seen what's possible." Jason stared out the window, the mountains blurring below. "I need time," he rasped, voice raw. "Back in Dust Haven, to think." Hawthorne's smile tightened, but he nodded. "Don't take too long, Creed. Opportunities like this don't wait." The jet touched down in Dust Haven under a bruised sky. Jason stepped onto the airstrip, the card crumpled in his fist. He didn't see the figure in the faded coat again, watching from the shadows, a gun glinting at his hip. Nor did he hear the whispered phone call. "He's back. Tell them it's time." The air in Dust Haven felt thicker when Jason returned, heavy with something unspoken. He trudged back to the garage, the familiar creak of the door a hollow comfort. Inside, the shadows stretched longer, the silence sharper. He dropped his duffel by the workbench and sank onto a stool, the card from Hawthorne still clenched in his hand. The facility's hum lingered in his ears. Those machines, that girl's laughter, the promise of something bigger. It clashed with the ghosts of his past, clawing up from the dark. The warehouse, the man's face, the life he'd fled. He pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the noise to stop. A knock shattered the quiet. Sharp, insistent. Jason's head snapped up, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He grabbed a wrench, an old habit, and edged toward the door. Through the grimy window he saw her, Ben's mother, her coat flapping in the wind, her face pale and drawn. Relief flickered, then died as he opened the door. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled note. "Jason," she whispered, voice breaking. "Ben's gone." The words hit like a fist. "Gone?" His grip tightened on the wrench. "What do you mean, gone?" She thrust the note at him. "This was on his bed. I went to the store, 30 minutes, and when I came back—" Her sob cut her off. Jason unfolded the paper, his gut sinking. Scrawled in jagged ink, "The boy's with us. Stay quiet or he pays. No signature, no demands. Just a threat, cold and final." "Who did this?" he growled, his voice low, dangerous. She shook her head, tears spilling. "I don't know. I thought, after you fixed his chair, maybe someone saw. Maybe—" Her words dissolved into panic. Jason's mind raced. The jet, Hawthorne, the man in the facility. Pieces clicked together, jagged and incomplete. Had his act of kindness painted a target on Ben? Or was this older, deeper, tied to the life he'd buried? He shoved the note into his pocket, his decision made before he could second-guess it. "I'll find him," he said, meeting her gaze. "I promise." She nodded, fragile hope flickering in her eyes. He didn't tell her he had no plan, no leads, just a fire igniting in his chest, a fury he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed his jacket and a flashlight, locking the garage behind him. The night swallowed him as he headed for the airstrip, the last place he'd felt the world shift. The strip was deserted, the wind howling through the weeds. Jason swept the beam of his flashlight across the ground, searching for anything, a tire mark, a footprint, a clue. Then he saw it, a glint in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away dust to reveal a shell casing, fresh and gleaming. His stomach lurched. He knew that caliber, 9mm, the kind he'd once carried, the kind his old crew favored. Footsteps crunched behind him. Jason spun, wrench raised, but froze as a figure emerged from the dark. The man from the facility, wiry and sharp-eyed, a smirk curling his lips. "Been a while, Creed," he said, voice like a blade on stone. "Didn't think you'd crawl out of your hole." "Vance," Jason spat, the name bitter on his tongue. A ghost from the warehouse, a traitor who'd sold him out. "Where's the boy?" Vance shrugged, casual despite the gun at his hip. "Safe, for now. Boss wants a word first." He stepped closer, eyes glinting. "You've been busy, fixing chairs, playing hero, but you can't outrun us." Jason's blood ran cold. "Boss? Hawthorne?" Vance laughed, sharp and hollow. "Hawthorne's a puppet. You'll see." He nodded toward the trees. "Come quiet, or the kid's next scar matches yours." Rage surged, but Jason forced it down. Ben's life hung on this moment. He lowered the wrench, jaw tight. "Lead the way." Vance smirked, turning toward the shadows. Jason followed, the night closing in, his mind a storm of guilt and dread. He'd fixed Ben's chair to give him freedom. Now it had chained them both to something dark. As they vanished into the trees, a distant rumble stirred the air, a jet circling back. The reckoning was here, and it wore a face Jason couldn't yet see. The trees loomed like sentinels as Jason followed Vance, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with damp earth and tension, each step a descent into a past he'd fought to bury. Ben's face flashed in his mind, those wide, trusting eyes that laugh when the wheelchair rolled free. Now the boy was a pawn in a game Jason didn't understand, and every second tightened the noose around his own neck. Vance moved ahead, silent and sure, the gun at his hip a quiet threat. Jason's hands itched for a weapon, for control, but he kept them loose. For Ben, he'd play this out. They emerged into a clearing, the jet's rumble growing louder overhead. A makeshift camp sprawled before him, tents, crates, armed men pacing the perimeter. In the center stood a figure Jason hadn't expected. Not Hawthorne, but a man he'd known a lifetime ago. Tall, broad, with a face carved from stone and eyes that burned with cold fire. Marcus Kane, his old commander, his betrayer. The man who'd left him bleeding in that warehouse. The scar on Jason's cheek, a permanent mark of that night. "Creed," Kane said, voice a low growl. "You've been hiding long enough." Jason's fists clenched. "Where's the boy?" Kane nodded to a tent. Through the flap, Jason glimpsed Ben, bound but alive, his small frame trembling. Relief crashed into fury. "Let him go, Kane. This isn't his fight." "It's yours," Kane snapped, stepping closer. "You walked away, left us to rot, but I rebuilt, found new purpose." He gestured to the crates, stamped with Hawthorne's logo, brimming with tech Jason recognized from the facility. Mobility devices, they call it. Weapons if you know how to use them. The truth slammed into Jason like a bullet. Hawthorne wasn't the mastermind. Kane was, twisting a noble cause into something dark. "You're using kids as leverage," he snarled. "For what?" "Power," Kane said simply. "Control. The world's weak, Creed. We can fix it. Our way. You were the best I had. I want you back." Jason's laugh was bitter, raw. "I'd rather die." Kane's eyes darkened. "That can be arranged." He signaled Vance, who drew his gun. But Jason was faster. Years of instinct surged, and he lunged, wrench slamming into Vance's wrist. The gun clattered to the dirt. Chaos erupted. Shouts, boots pounding, metal clashing. Jason fought like a man possessed. Every blow for Ben, for the life he tried to build. The jet landed, its roar drowning the melee. Hawthorne emerged, pale and frantic, flanked by guards. "Kane, stop this," he yelled. "This wasn't the deal." Kane turned, cold as ice. "You're done, Hawthorne." A shot rang out. Hawthorne crumpled, blood blooming on his chest. Jason seized the moment, diving for Ben's tent. He cut the ropes, pulling the boy into his arms. "Hold on," he whispered, voice breaking. Ben clung to him, silent tears soaking Jason's shirt. Kane's men closed in, but the tide shifted. Sirens wailed, lights flashing through the trees. Police drawn by the jet's unscheduled landing. Kane roared orders, but it was too late. Jason shielded Ben as bullets flew, declaring a storm of violence and redemption. When the dust settled, Kane was in cuffs, his empire shattered. Jason knelt beside Ben, heart pounding, the boy's small hand gripping his. Days later, Dust Haven buzzed with quiet awe. Jason reopened the garage, but it wasn't the same. A new wheelchair sat in the corner. Sleek, custom, a gift from Ben, delivered with a shy smile and his mother's tearful thanks. Hawthorne's facility, cleansed of Kane's shadow, offered Jason a role again. This time he took it, not for escape, but for purpose. He'd build, not destroy. Standing with Ben at the airstrip, watching a jet lift off with hope instead of dread, Jason felt the weight lift. "You saved me too, kid," he murmured. Ben grinned, rolling free. The scar remained, but the ghosts were quiet. Kindness had sparked a storm, and from its ashes, a new life rose.